Thank you, and I'd like to also thank the AMPC for inviting me to speak. It's a real pleasure to come and speak to this group. Some of you know me, and also it was I thought a very touching story you told us before about what you're doing. Really impressed. So yes, I agree. I teach master's students who come from all over the world, including Australia, teach them about meat and meat products, funnily enough. And I say to my students, and there's a company in the room who has this motto, turn to your friend who's not in food and say, what did you do today? And for a food scientist, they can say, I fed the world. That's a great motto that I think we've got. Just talk about feeding the world. And also, I have a PhD student from Pakistan, and part of her focus is to go back to her country and work out how to get better nutrition for people in her country, the kids, because of course protein and especially meat is very important for cognitive development. So that's some of the issues. So there's my introduction slide down here. So I'm going to be talking about one definition of sustainability, and also, is this timer going to work? It still says 4:39. And latest innovations, history and new horizons from a qualities perspective. So I'll talk about some of these innovation technologies for tenderising. A little bit about dry aging, just one slide. It's some work we've been doing. One slide on some work we're starting on detecting pre-slaughter stress. And if there's time, I might talk briefly about packaging also. So this does follow on well from what Declan was saying. So in order for our industry to be sustainable, because the theme of the conference is sustainability, my definition is the capacity to be maintained into the future. Thus, an industry which is sustainable can continue to make profit and will be successful into the future. And in order to achieve this, the red meat industry must pay attention to one very important object, who of course is the consumer in any market in the world. So they must continually be satisfied so they can continue to purchase beef, so it should be red meat products. And what does the consumer want? And I do talk in terms of innovations in food and meat science. From my perspective, is from quality. So if you had a microbiologist here, they'd give a different perspective, and my lens is quality. So of course, safety is very important for red meat, and I think the consumer assumes it is safe. Quality is vital, must be visually appealing, so I'll talk a little bit about colour towards the end. Sensory traits, it's got to be tender, juicy, flavourful, and also what we call the credence values, such as welfare, environment, clean and green, and healthy, also are important to the consumer in certainly some markets. So just to remind everyone that, in fact, it has been documented that if we produce better quality meat, the benefits do flow back to the producer as well as to the processor and the retailer. So in MSA, they've shown that for the processor, which is the red line on this graph, the y-axis is the premiums in cents per kilograms, and the x-axis is the financial year. So in 2011, the premium to the processor was 25 cents per kilogram for MSA-graded quality beef. So the consumer is number one, and tenderisation is important, certainly in a lot of the markets that we export to when we have prime bulls. So, and we do, as Declan and the earlier speakers mentioned, we do need to make sure we follow any changes in consumer trends, and there's a risk in not following those trends. So some of the innovative technologies for tenderisation include talking about controlling tenderisation to suit different demographics and different markets. So certainly some consumers want a certain tenderness to the meat, but for the elderly, it's possible we need to have mushy, almost very soft meat so they can actually chew it when they're dentally challenged, which some of us, like me, might be in 20 years' time. So it's about controlling tenderisation to meet the need of the marketplace. And also part of the project that we're going to be doing going forward is looking at whether we can produce tender meat at 24 hours post-slaughter. So this area is actually mentioned on page 27 of the Feast of Ideas. So I'm just going to briefly mention, I don't want to bore you with too much on my love of biochemistry and structure of muscle, which is very interesting. But the main influences on tenderness are collagen, how much collagen's there. So all of the muscles vary in how much collagen's there, especially the cross-links. The length of the sarcomere, so how we treat that carcass post-slaughter before rigour sets in, is really important for how much shortened that sarcomere is. And then the proteases breaking down the structure during the ageing process. So all of these three are really important in terms of determining tenderisation. So some of the technologies I'll talk about actually work on different parts of that. So some might work on the collagen part, some might work on actually preventing the shortening of the sarcomere, and some actually work on accelerating the breakdown of the muscle structure. So they actually work on different parts of the important traits of tenderness. So in terms of some of the technologies for controlling tenderisation, and I've been involved in conducting what we call a big review for MLA and a meta-analysis, so taking studies from all over the world and seeing what effects there were on the tenderisation of beef. So some of the examples are the ones that we looked at were sous vide cooking, which although it's been around for a number of years, I think since the 1960s in fact, in spite of the fact that I have a question mark there. High pressure processing, which has been around since 1973 in terms of papers for meat. Shockwave, which is detonation shockwave. That was called exploding beef when it was first trialled in USA, and they put a whole big beef carcass right down into this massive chamber and they actually put explosives into the water. Now they worked out that wasn't very safe to use in a meat plant, so the more recent advance in this has been to go to electrical shock waves generated through electricity. And that more recent version of it has only come out since in 2000 in terms of the research. So there's also pulsed electric field. It's a very new field for tenderisation of meat, only been around in terms of the papers since 2013. Ultrasound, and also that tender stretch has been around since 1970, and certainly one person in the audience knows how fantastic tender stretch, which means hanging the carcass differently, will give great tenderisation. It'll prevent a lot of the quality problems in any carcass, including beef and lamb and goat carcasses. And the alternative is, which I've got there, is smart stretch, which is something that was developed in New Zealand, and some of you might have trialled in your plants, where you actually take hot-boned meat and put it into a package and prevent it from shortening. So I'll show you the results for some of these. So smart stretch has only been around since 2010, as far as I'm aware, and Europe had a similar one called PIVAC, which was around probably earlier than that. So sous vide cooking, just very briefly, it's a cooking method. It is really taking off in restaurants around the world in the food service industry, in which raw food is cooked inside a vacuum pouch, often at a low temperature, so 55 to 65, for an extended period. So I'm talking about often, sometimes 18 to 24 hours. It is increasingly popular with food service. So I tried to find an image of sous vide cooking, and it was interesting. The only images I could find were actually pictures of meat being cooked in sous vide in a lab, so that was a little bit interesting, I thought. But just a little bit of structure and chemistry here. Basically, what we're relying on, this picture here shows, as you increase the temperature, cooking temperature, from 50 up to 90, you get this, increase in water loss as the temperature, cooking temperature increases. And correspondingly, as the temperature increases, you get this decline in juiciness of the meat. And really, if you can stick basically below about 65 degrees, you get less shortening in the muscle structure, and so you actually retain more moisture. It's more juicy, and also this picture now is a picture of tenderness. A classic graph from a while ago showing that if you stay below 65, you don't get this increase in toughness, which happens above 65, as you go to temperatures above 65 degrees. So sous vide can certainly produce a very tender meat for ready-to-eat meals or food service. Because it's in a vacuum pouch, it actually can stay sterile in that environment and go straight to the consumer, or you can take it out and actually grill it up and give it a little bit of Maillard reaction on the surface to give it some taste. The other thing about sous vide cooking, I think, is that we have a PhD student presently working on this, is in fact that this picture here is some data from Denmark, so they only have bulls in Denmark and cows, but the cooking conditions for high quality meat and low quality meat is different. So we still need to optimise what these are. So in this graph here, just to summarise it for you, the tender strip loins from young bulls became tender at 58 to 63 degrees after 2.5 hours of cooking. So tender very quickly, whereas the old cow's strip loin was tender only after 19.5 hours at 63. So we need to really optimise this, make sure we optimise this sous vide cooking process for different animals, different muscles, and also different quality carcasses. So this is now some of the data from the meta-analysis that we conducted. And what you'll see here is the number in brackets is how many actual tests we looked at to produce this data. So we talked before about pulsed electric field, shock wave, exploding beef is this one here, smart stretch, ultrasound and high pressure processing. So now I split them into hot boned and cold boned. And some of you I know do some hot boning. For pulsed electric field, you're only going to get a big increase in Warner-Brateller shear force. A lot of the studies don't have sensory, they only have Warner-Brateller shear force. For cold bone, this nice increase in shear force of 7.1, no effect if you do it in hot bone meat. Shockwave, the old form of detonation shockwave, which was exploding beef, gave a very good increase in tenderisation of almost 20 newtons. That is fantastic. But the more recent one, which is now actually safe to use in plants, only about 5.2. So smart stretch, I don't have the data for tender stretch, but we know it will produce very tender meat. But if you actually do smart stretch, really good improvement in shear force of 10.8 newtons. So really significant improvement in tenderness. Ultrasound, the average was 6. I don't think ultrasound overall was really beneficial for increasing tenderisation. High pressure processing, now here if you do it pre-rigor, and there is some patents around from Hormel and other companies on doing it pre-rigor, as well as McFarlane doing it in the 1970s in Australia, massive increase in tenderisation of 82 newtons compared to cold boning, overall 37, but if you do it using the optimised process of 100 to 200 megapascals, again, really big increase in tenderisation of 50 newtons. So I just wanted to maybe give you a comparison of what some of these technologies do in terms of tenderisation compared to something you may be more familiar with. So we noted if we have HGP implants in our cattle, and they're used in Australia, they increase the muscling and the carcass yield and the rate to reduce the time to slaughter, but they do in fact decrease the consumer score by about 5 consumer points and increase the Warner-Brateller shear force by about 2.6 newtons. So this is in the next graphs, I'll show you a comparison to HGPs in terms of these technologies, because HGPs are in the MSA model, and if you deliver a HGP-treated animal to the processing plant, they are docked 5 points in the strip loin and more in other muscles. They have to be aged for longer. So I wanted to give you a comparison to this technology. Other examples of animal effects on tenderness include Bos indicus, which we know if you've got more Bos indicus, the meat will be tougher, so you have to age it for longer. And also Saliards. So in this graph here, I've just taken some of the data in the previous table on these technologies, and I've compared it to some of these pre-slaughter animal effects. So here's HGPs overall, 5 minutes, thank you. Decrease the tenderness by about 2.5 newtons. If you use an aggressive HGP, it actually doubles the increase in toughness right down below -5. Similarly, the beta agonists, which we're not necessarily using in Australia, something called ractopamine has a really negative effect on tenderness and drops it right down to below -5. And this red line here means when it's really important for the consumer, because it's going to have a detrimental effect on eating quality, and they'll perceive it and they'll pick it up. So that's what that red line means. And we'll see that for cold bone PEF, nice increase in tenderisation, shockwave electrical, smart stretch, really good increase in tenderisation, and also ultrasound. And this one now, I had to do it on 2 graphs to fit them all in. I've dropped a couple of the technologies out, But you'll see for HPP, in comparison, this massive increase in tenderisation if you use HPP overall or this hot boning process as well. So just showing that, and these are the, in comparison to the HGP effect here or the aggressive HGP effect. So showing if you've got muscles that are substantially tough, you can actually tenderise them using HPP. High pressure processing, sorry. So one of the detrimental things about high pressure processing, it is not for the fresh meat trade at the moment. It's feasible for ready-to-eat meals because if you apply high pressure processing, you actually get this change, this in colour of the actual meat cubes. So really it's only for ready-to-eat meals because it doesn't look like a fresh meat product. So I think the innovation that may occur in the future is to be able to have HPP meat on the fresh meat cells if we can retain the fresh colour. But certainly in the high pressure processing area, we do need more consumer and sensory studies. 1 minute, thank you. So this is now a project that's listed in the Feast of Ideas on page 27, which talks about tenderisation technologies and also accelerated tenderisation, which is a project that we'll be undertaking with AMPC and also in collaboration with Ireland with Declan Troy at Jigisk. So the concept is not to take one technology, but to take a few of them and try to control tenderisation and also hopefully produce tender meat at 24 hours. Oh, wrong one. So in terms of dry aged beef, we've been doing a project funded by MLA and just trying to show that we can get, see if we can get premiums for dry aged beef in the MSA model. And also in the future, I think we'll have some innovative and model ways to actually dry aged beef and maybe lamb and goat meat while it's being exported overseas, because at the moment you can't actually export dry aged meat and have it dry aging in transit. Some other work in Melbourne Uni, we're looking at innovations for non-invasive monitoring of pre-slaughter stress and looking at the infrared thermal image analysis and detecting heart rate, respiration, etc., with the concept that we might be able to detect pre-slaughter stress and use it as a quality and welfare indicator. So I'm going to flick over the packaging story, go to my last slide. So in this presentation, I've talked about some of the innovative technologies for tenderising meat and also this non-invasive monitoring for dark cutting and pre-slaughter stress. But similarly to what Declan said, we also think it's important to start with the market and the consumer. So in Melbourne University, we have a Mondelez Melbourne University Research Hub looking at where we're exporting, helping to export confectionery to China. And we've now had permission from the Research Hub to take the IP from the confectionery industry into the food, and in particular, the meat industry. So we're taking their learnings in packaging and temperature modelling and chemical engineering, as well as their consumer sensory and market analysis into the meat industry, and just following it through the chain where it's really it should be a cycle. You start with the consumer and the market, work out your packaging and storage, processing, pre-harvest on farm, what's the requirements at each step, and then come back to this consumer again to refine the process. That's the way we've been working with our research.